Good afternoon, everybody. We're carrying on this afternoon in our series in John. Those of you that have been following this so far, we come to chapter 2 today, and the start of Jesus' ministry. We are going to have Esther in a moment read to us from the beginning of chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, and the words will come up on the screen here. The catchphrase or the heading over this part in John chapters 2, 3 and 4 is essentially the old has gone and the new has come. And we have Jesus showing us various different newnesses, different things that he's come to fulfill. And we start here with the wedding in Cana. So Esther is going to read to us now from chapter 2.
On the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had poured the wine knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory to his disciples that believed in him.
Thanks, Esther. So in this chapter we come to what John calls his first sign, Jesus' first sign. He didn't call them miracles, he called them signs. And there are 7 of them in John, that number again, 7, the perfect number. And with each one, John is taking us on a journey of revealing who Jesus is. And we think about his purpose in writing the letter. John 20 verse 31 says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So he starts by numbering the signs, the first 2, number 1 here and then number 2, and then he leaves it to us to count the rest. And here the first sign is water into wine. John starts this by saying, "On the third day." He didn't waste words, John. So the whole lot's carefully crafted sentences and stories by a skilled story master. And he wants us to count these days. And as we've noted before, John starts his gospel with the words like Genesis, "in the beginning." And so over this first chapter, we can assume that John is showing us something new. And just like the creation week in Genesis, John walks us through a week here at the beginning of his gospel, counting the days. And he finishes the week here with this miracle. And what does Jesus do in this week of new creation? He gathers people. And right at the end of this week, here at the wedding, John finishes with a sign that demonstrates what Jesus came to fulfill. The new covenant, a new way of God relating to his people, God relating to mankind. It's another newness that we see in John. So Jesus is at a wedding in Cana. Cana's the next village along from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. But the whole village affair, this wedding will have been. And this is where Philip and Nathanael came from this village. And from Nathanael's comments in the first chapter, we can assume there's probably a little bit of rivalry between towns. Can anything good come out of Nazareth, was Nathanael's comments. So when the wine ran out, it says Jesus' mother came to him and said, the wine's run out. And I think it's important for us to know that this was quite a big deal, particularly in those days. I mean, if the wine runs out at a wedding, it's a big deal anyway. But in those days, in the shame culture, that if wine ran out at a wedding, this would have been an utter disgrace to the family, and one that would have gone on and on and on. The family would have not lived that down, and it may have even had implications for bad luck for the marriage itself. And so here we see Jesus intervening in a very personal way, in a response to a need in people's lives, and at the same time revealing something profound about himself for those with eyes to see. And Jesus said, my hour has not yet come, in response to his mum, who said, they've run out of wine. He said, my hour has not yet come. And why did he say that? Well, clearly he had started his ministry. So he had been filled with the Spirit, and he had does the miracle in the end. So he can't mean that it's not right for me to do the miracle. And when you look through the rest of John, when he says my hour has not yet come, he's talking about his death. And you hear things throughout it, things like no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. So what's the relevance here? Maybe it's because a big miracle here, a big public miracle, might have accelerated his journey to the cross. And Jesus knew that wasn't the right timing. There was stuff that he needed to do between now and that point. A journey he needed to take his disciples on, for instance. And this miracle, after all, was quite a private miracle in the end. Many didn't see, many didn't know. The master of the ceremony didn't know. I mean, if you compare it to the miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead further on in John, and the swiftness of the events that followed that led to Jesus' death, that may be what Jesus was meaning here. There is a point in John's Gospel, a response to a specific event where Jesus says, the hour has now come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And you can search through John and find out what that event is. But his mum then says to him, to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And here we've got his mum demonstrating that kind of faith that Jesus responds to all through the gospel, and the kind of faith that John wants to build in the readers. John records that there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, and Jesus said, fill those with water, and so they did. There were many occasions in the Jewish law that people had to wash themselves and purify themselves, including eating. It was a sort of external washing as part of what the law required. And there were 6 jars, John notes. 6, again, that number we've noted before, incomplete, imperfect. And these jars together would have held about 750 litres, it tells us. That's about 1,000 bottles of wine. A lot of wine. And then Jesus said, after they'd filled the jars with water, he says, now take some to the master of the ceremony, master of the banquet. So they did. And when he tasted it, he said this. He said, everybody brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now. Water for washing into wine for drinking. Water for external, that part of ritual cleansing of the law. It's never going to really remove the real dirt, never going to change the heart, changed into wine for drinking, to take inside. Something we do into something that we receive. A job, a ritual, into a joy, a gift. The promised new covenant, the promised new way that we have mankind, that we would relate to God. Jesus came to do something new and something better than the old. Most people bring the best out first, but you have kept the best until now. The old covenant, the rules by which outlining the way that God would relate to man were good. God says, if you do this, he said to his people, if you do this, then I will make you my treasured possession in all the earth. This is God, the Creator, saying to his people, I want that relationship. If you do this, then I will make you my treasured possession. But the issue was they couldn't keep their side of the covenant, their side of the agreement. It didn't deal with the fundamental issue, the fundamental problem of sin, not once and for all. The sacrifices and these washings had to be done again and again repeatedly. If you take your car to the mechanics to deal with a specific problem, if you have to keep going back again and again with the same problem, then that's a sign that the problem hasn't been dealt with. The new covenant is better. There's one book in the New Testament that talks about the new covenant specifically more than any of the other books, and how Jesus fulfills all the whole of the Old Testament prophecies, and the Old Testament points to him, and that's the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews uses the word better more than all of the rest of the New Testament put together. John doesn't mention in his Gospel communion, bread and wine. The Last Supper is more of a long dialogue. But perhaps here the wine alludes to that. This is what Luke says about the bread and wine at the Last Supper. He says, Jesus says, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. That's what Jesus said. One sacrifice, Jesus, whose blood would take away our sin, deal with it for good. And with it, this new covenant comes the promise of new life and of change. Hundreds of years before Jesus came, Ezekiel records this. So God promises his new covenant. And in Ezekiel we can read what God says. He says, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean. From all your uncleanness and from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove your heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my ways and be careful to obey all my rules. The promise of change. Sprinkle clean my spirit within you, a new heart. Not just an external washing, but a change within. Sin dealt with once and for all. Water for washing that will never really clean, into wine for drinking. The transformation of water into wine demonstrates, it brings to life, more than all the other writings and prophecies for me, the transforming effect that Jesus has on our lives. The answer when we're weary and when we're fed up with our inability to change is never to try harder, but it is to come to Jesus who transforms. And the message that we take to the world is not a set of rules and regulations, a good moral standard. It's a person. It's Jesus. It's Jesus who will change them. So here we have John demonstrating Jesus meeting someone's need at a wedding when they run out of wine, and at the same time revealing something about himself, what he came to bring. Newness, new life, transformation, a new way of us relating to God. Changed, the promise of changed lives.